thus far in this section, we have been talking about these three revolutions, right? We first talked about an economic revolution, a political revolution, and finally a scientific revolution. And I've been talking in part about how they can be brought together. I've kind of given some examples of that as we've gone through, but now I'm going to focus more closely on how people are going to bring these revolutions together and how that's going to lead to even more changes in European society. And I think a perfect example, in a sense, to bring as many of these as possible together is Adam Smith. Right. So what happens is people start to say, you know what? These scientists are beginning to understand the laws that govern nature, that govern the natural world. Well, aren't human beings a kind of part of nature? And if there's laws like the law of gravity that control how objects move, maybe there's laws governing human society. And if we could better understand those laws, maybe we could make better human societies, right? So if I can understand physics, which allows me to build a better cannon, maybe if I understand how the economy works in a better way, I can build a better economy and build a better society. And one person who tried to do that was Adam Smith, a Scottish, so for our purposes, basically British. Scotland's a part of Britain in this time period. Economist, thinker. And Adam Smith is going to argue for several important ideas. And I think he's, like I said, a perfect person for showing how these revolutions pull together. One thing he argues is for free markets, right? He argues that free markets determine prices and allocate goods more efficiently than anything else. So you may recall an economics class in high school or even at college here, where you made the supply curve and the demand curve, and where they met is where the price should be, right? If there's this many people selling this many strawberries, and this is the demand for strawberries, this is how much strawberries will cost on the market. And you may remember, if you did something like set the price of strawberries too low, you will have a shortage. And if you set the price too high, people will stop, because people will stop making strawberries, right? If you set the prices too low, people won't grow strawberries because they won't make any money, and there will be a shortage of strawberries. On the other hand, if you set the prices too high, people won't be able to get strawberries. And this is something governments had traditionally done, right? Governments would say, oh, the price of that good is too high. People can't afford it. And then they would make a price, they would put out a price control, and that would just cause a shortage of the good or would cause some other problem. So what's key here, right? Smith is arguing now through his scientific understanding of the economy, there's two of our revolutions right there, that we should take certain political actions, or rather we should not take certain political actions. We should not try and control prices. The government should not try and set prices. The government should stand back and let the market determine the price, supply and demand, because it does that more efficiently. To give you another example, Adam Smith believed in something called comparative advantage. This idea that everyone wins when we specialize and then trade. So for example, England is good. England had a lot of sheep. It had a lot of wool. So it would make sense. And on the other hand, England is too cold to have a lot of grapes. So England didn't have good wine. On the other hand, Italy was really good at growing grapes and not as good at producing wool. So instead of England producing bad wine and good wool, and Italy producing good wine and bad wool, why not just England concentrate on making wool and Italy concentrate on making wine, and then they trade their surplus? And that way Italians get good wine and good wool, and English people get good wine and good wool. Right? The idea of comparative advantage is everyone wins when we specialize and then trade. Therefore, governments should not tax imports or should not tax them too much. Those are what we call tariffs. A tax on an import is a tariff. And sometimes governments use tariffs to protect their industries well, we need to protect the English wine industry. So we're going to put a tariff on this on this Italian wine to make it too expensive. Well, Adam Smith is like, well, that's illogical. Don't do that. Right? We shouldn't be worrying about English people making wine. We need to both be doing what we do best. We make good wool, they make good wine. Keep out the tariffs. Let's trade. So for Adam Smith, mercantilism was terrible. Right? From Adam Smith's perspective, the idea of trying to control trade in the way that mercantilism did was a bad idea. And remember, mercantilists held that the economy was win-lose. They tied economic development to natural resources. And if I control a mine, you don't control that mine, I win, you lose. But Adam Smith says, no. When we do what we do best and trade, everyone wins. So it's not a zero-sum game. We need to encourage trade because with trade, everyone wins. So I want to stress here, you can see how the revolutions are coming together. Adam Smith, inspired by the power of science to explain our natural world, tries to explain this, to apply the scientific method of direct observation to the economy. And based on what he discovers about the economy and the laws that govern the economy, he argues that governments should follow particular policies. For example, don't worry about this mercantilism stuff. It's not good. Focus instead on free trade because then everybody wins. And this, in a sense, is also the birth of what we call social sciences, right? So, for example, if you're majoring in psychology or sociology or something like that, that's what this is. This is a social science. And like I said, there's this idea that if we can better understand society, we can apply that knowledge, for example, in government policies to make the world better. And all those things are represented by Adam Smith. And these kinds of ideas lead to what we call the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment. And in particular, when you think about the Enlightenment, think about it critiquing society. Now, the Enlightenment was centered in France. France was a leading light in scientific thinking, as well as thinking about how we could understand the laws that govern human society better. And the Enlightenment in particular holds this idea that reason and science can lead to a better society, right? We saw that with Adam Smith. If we apply our reason, if we apply science to building a better society, we can live better and happier, more fulfilling lives. Now, that sounds really good, but there's kind of an issue with this, because if we're going to try and improve society, that means that there's something wrong with society, right? That means there's something wrong with society. So people who believed in the Enlightenment often used reason and science, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly, to challenge tradition and authority, right? Some of them would challenge tradition and authority. This could include criticizing religious tradition, saying, well, this religion doesn't make sense. It seems superstitious. It seems irrational. Therefore, we should not follow it. It also led to the criticism of authority. Why should this king rule us just because his dad was king? Why should we even have kings? Kings could, you could have a dumb person become king. Why should we do what that king says? He's not very smart. And it could also lead to criticism of nobility. Why should we do what the nobility says? They just have authority because they were born of noble parents. Maybe authority should go someplace else. So the Enlightenment could very easily lead to ideas of equality and democracy, right? People would look at particularly the authority wielded by kings and nobles and say, why should these guys have power? I'm just as rational as them. Maybe I'm better educated. Maybe I'm smarter. So why is it that I should do what they say? This seems irrational. Now, I should stress that's only one part of the Enlightenment. There was also the role of enlightened despots like Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great was the ruler of Russia, right? She ruled the Russian Empire. And what she argued was, I am enlightened, I am intelligent, and I'm educated, and therefore I need to reform my country along Enlightenment ideas. And she did this by building hospitals, by building schools, by building planned cities that had really good sewer systems and good things like that. But she was not for equality. She would give her favorites at court gifts of land that included serfs to work the land. Serfs aren't quite free, or aren't quite slaves, but they're also not quite free. I mean, like I said, she's giving these people away. But she rejected ideas of equality and democracy, but still understood herself as enlightened because she said, I am a despot, a ruler ruling absolutely because I'm enlightened, because I know what's best for my country, and I've reformed my country along Enlightenment ideas. For our purposes, though, right, I need to mention that enlightened despots do exist. I do want to emphasize that these ideas of equality and democracy rising out of the Enlightenment are extraordinarily powerful and will lead to extraordinarily important revolutions. And if you guessed like the American Revolution, you would be correct, right? One of the revolutions that the Enlightenment helps lead to is the American Revolution. So remember we talked about the 7 Years' War and how Britain had to borrow money from its people by selling bonds to pay for the 7 Years' War, to build that navy and so forth. Well, they won. And now they have to pay that debt. And you may remember we talked about how the 7 Years' War was, in a sense, a kind of almost a world war, in that it took part not really much in Europe. It took part in places like India, the Caribbean, and of course North America. So it cost a lot of money, and it was, like I said, a colonial war. And what the British said to the American colonists, remember, the United States didn't exist yet. We were a series of colonies, part of the British Empire. The British government said, well, you Americans, we fought this war in part to protect you from the French. So we need you to help pay back this money that we borrowed to win the war, and we need you to help pay for its continued defense because you are costing us a lot of money. Now, that is a reasonable thing, I think, to say. Right? The Americans benefited from the war. The British did spend a lot of money on it. However, the Americans also had a pretty good counter argument. We pointed out that we had paid in blood. Right? A lot of Americans, colonists, had died in the 7 Years' War, and so the idea that many were kind of offended by this idea that we didn't really do anything to help. Well, we did. We lost a lot of people. But also this touched on other ideas. Americans wanted more of a say in running their economy. This is kind of connected to a principle. Remember John Locke and the English Revolution, where English people wanted to have a say in how taxes were collected, how much taxes were collected, and how they were spent. Right? Americans are like, we're also English. We want to have, like other English subjects, the right to have a say in how our taxes are spent, right? And how much they're collected and so forth. So Americans were upset about this. In addition, Americans were upset about mercantilism. Remember that picture, and I tried to stress this, keep this in mind, of the woman being served by the maids. The woman was the mother country, and the maids, the servants, were bringing her food, and those maids represent the colonies. Americans were saying, we're tired of this. We don't want to be simply your servant, England. We want to have a say in how our economy is run. For instance, we want the freedom to trade to other countries. You're forcing us to trade with you, but there are other countries who will pay us more money for our goods. And we want to sell to those countries, but you're making that illegal because you want us to be your servants. So basically, Americans want more autonomy, particularly in the economy, but as we've noted, that's related to politics, right? Americans want representation. They want the right to be able to talk about how taxes are collected and how they're spent. They believe that, following John Locke, that that governments exist to protect property, and fair taxation is a part of that. And also, Americans want to be able to pursue trade policies that don't simply benefit England, that don't simply benefit Great Britain, but that also help them. We want to be able to trade with who we want, not simply do what Britain says. So inspired by Enlightenment thinkers, the Greeks and the Romans, and traditional British ideas of liberty connected with these issues we just discussed, the Americans will rebel. and I include this famous image, join or die, to help kind of transport us back to this time period to think about the American Revolution, but also just to complain, why does South Carolina have to be the tail, right? We should be the head, darn it, not the tail. Now, the Americans did win this war, and I need to talk a little bit about why Americans win this war. First of all, Britain is far away, and it is hard to supply an army from a long distance. It's hard to supply an army across the Atlantic Ocean. Also, the American colonies covered a great deal of territory. So Britain, in order to win this war, really needed a much bigger army than it could really build and support. And one thing, if you study the American Revolution, I mean, the British could pretty much almost always defeated the Americans in battle, but then the Americans would just like go somewhere else and cause problems, and the British would have to chase after them, and they would just have to abandon whatever city they just took over. So the problem was, Britain is just really far away. It's hard to supply an army from that great of distance, and they really needed a bigger army that they could possibly even build or supply, because the American colonies are gigantic. And what's key is also Americans did use guerrilla warfare well, but also we learned how to defeat the British in conventional battle. Americans did learn to fight like the British. We'll talk about this later, but people sometimes poke fun at the British for wearing red uniforms and so forth. Actually, that's not a bad idea when battlefields are covered in smoke. And what was key for us to be able to actually win the revolution was that we had to defeat the British in stand-up battles, which we did do once we learned how to fight conventional stand-up battles. Another key figure in the war is George Washington. He's key for two reasons. One is that he was a general who was really good at retreating. That sounds really weird, but if you actually look at Washington, he lost battles all the time, but he always kept his army intact. So he may lose a battle, but he would retreat typically in good order. His army would stay in the field, and so the British had to commit lots of troops that they couldn't continue to afford keeping in the field to try and deal with him, right? So the British were just never able to destroy his army. And so even though they would defeat him over and over again, they just couldn't conquer him. In addition, and this will become important as we study other revolutions, Washington really believed in limited power, right? He didn't want to be king. There were people who wanted to make him king, but he didn't want that. He really did believe in a kind of system that was not built just around one person. He believed in a democracy, and as such, he did not want to become king. He wanted a democracy where you didn't have a king ruling over people, but where people governed themselves. And that's important because he could have stayed president as long as he wanted. He could have perhaps even become king. He refused to do those things, and that led to the establishment of a republic. And that was really revolutionary at the time period. But one thing I really, really want to emphasize is if you look at this image, you can see the Americans on the right. You can see British soldiers in the middle, on the left, center. But on the far left, those are not British soldiers, those are French soldiers. The Americans were able to win this war in a large part because of massive French military support. The French Navy was key to the Americans winning the revolution, because the problem is whenever we did defeat the British, they would just get on their ships and go someplace else until the French defeated the British Navy and prevented that from happening, forcing the British to actually surrender at Yorktown. Similarly, half the troops in the final major battle at Yorktown were French. And France, I think, supplied something like 80% of the American gunpowder. So this will become very important later on, but I want to emphasize for here just that this is key to why the Americans are able to win, that this is, again, a kind of a global war where we're receiving massive French military support. We don't just do it on our own. Now, I have to stress that in many ways, the American Revolution was truly revolutionary in terms of politics. We threw out British rule in favor of a republic in which people voted to elect their officials. Now, we look back at this in the time period and say, well, wait a second. Only white male property owners at first were able to vote. And that's true. And from our perspective, this seems, certainly not far enough. But in the time period, people thought this was crazy. Many people, especially in Europe, predicted that the American experiment in democracy would fail. They argued, in part because of their own history of their civil wars, that you could not have a system without a strong, or at least a monarch. But we got rid of a monarch. So I want to stress, even though from our side perspective, politically, this seems kind of limited, from the time period, the idea of having people who governed themselves without a king was bizarre, and people predicted that it would not last. It's still going strong. However, in other ways, this was a conservative revolution, right? It's radical in terms of its politics, but socially, it stays much the same. For example, if you were wealthy before the American Revolution, like George Washington, you were probably still wealthy after the American Revolution, right? This was not a massive change in terms of society or economics. That kind of pretty much stayed the same. Unless you were a loyalist who lost your property because the British lost the war. If you were wealthy before the war, you probably were wealthy afterwards. If you were poor before the war, you're probably poor beforehand, right? So people like George Washington, who were wealthy before the war, are still wealthy after the war. But there's also a tension here that we really have to stress. That even though this revolution was undertaken in the name of liberty, that liberty was for slaveholders, but not slaves. So people like George Washington, who fought for liberty, only understood that liberty as extending to a small part of the human family. It did not extend to their slaves. Now, in fairness, Washington did not like slavery, but that didn't lead him to free his slaves while he was alive. And I mean, people are like, well, they did free him after he died. And it's like, well, when he didn't need them anymore, he did free them. I mean, that's not particularly impressive to me. I would be much more impressed if he would have freed them while he was alive and then made movements to end the whole system. But in any case, we have a serious tension within the American Revolution. Liberty for slaveholders, not for slaves. And we'll talk more about this when we get to the Haitian and French revolutions. But I have to highlight this, right, that there is a significant problem here. However, there also is a massive change in that democracy, because it understands power is rising up from the people and not down from God, is able to engage in much more religious tolerance, right? So, for example, in a country where there is only one major religion and it's an official religion, if you don't belong to that official religion, the government doesn't trust you. It's like, well, why don't you believe in the official religion? This is the religion the government supports. Don't you support it? And, if you're the king of France and you believe that your power comes from God, and some people don't believe the same thing you do about God, you're going to be suspicious of them. You're going to say, I don't know if I can believe these people. I don't know if they're loyal. But in the American Revolution, because we develop a democracy in which power comes from the people, sovereignty comes from the people, not from God, that allows us to give people more religious freedom, because religion, you can believe in a different religion and still be considered politically loyal. Right? Since there's no state church, you can still be considered politically loyal even if you believe in a different religion.